Hey friends, thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation Dick and I had about ground effect. Are you a non-STEM, non-racer like me? Then if you haven't already, make sure and listen to an earlier conversation Dick and I had, Aerodynamics 101. During that conversation, Dick explained the basic principles of Aero as it relates to Formula One. This episode expands on a specific area related to Aero, ground effect. As you'll hear, I had a ton of questions and Dick did his best to simplify a very complicated aspect of Formula One. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Dick, ground effect. What exactly is ground effect? This is something that is important to how cars work, and it affects the setup, which are all things that we mentioned, I feel like at least in passing, when we did our F1 lingo conversation. For people who haven't already listened to that, I think that's a good primer. And now we can expand a bit in the concept of ground effect.
Is an aerodynamic term that is applied to a race car where you make downforce on the underbody of the car. I mean, for the longest time, race cars had wings at the front and the rear. And those wings, of course, are upside down airplane wings. And so instead of providing lift, they provide downforce. And the trade-off is that given the size of the wing, how wide is it? What's the chord, which is how, the depth of the wing, basically from the leading edge to the trailing edge. And then the shape of the wing itself will determine how much downforce it makes and how much drag it creates. Okay. And so the more downforce you make, the odds are really, really good that you're going to make more drag to go with it. So you may have more downforce that allows you to go faster through the corners, but because of that extra drag, you're slower down the straightaways. And so race engineers for years, and even in classes today where ground effect is not allowed, you're constantly chasing that trade-off between how much downforce do I need versus how much drag can I get away with on the straightaways. And so you may have a track with a really, really long straightaway and then a lot of slow to mid-speed corners. Well, you need that downforce on those slow to mid-speed corners, but you're getting killed going down the straightaway if you have too much wing on the car because of all the drag it's creating, and you're not getting the top speed that your competition is. And so you're constantly working back and forth to get that balance right. And then, the other part to complicate it, and this is way outside of the conversation, but, the wing angles or the type of wing that you run on one day could actually change to the next day, depending on the atmospheric pressure. If the barometric pressure goes up or down, you're going to have to change your wing angles to get the same balance between, downforce and drag. So it's a really, it's a complex thing. And the top teams, even today, are always dealing with what's my barometric pressure looking like? What's my air density? How does that then impact downforce levels on the car?
Can I interrupt you?
Sure.
And ask a clarifying question or restatement to make sure
Of course.
for all the non-STEM people like me who are listening to this. So what I'm hearing you say is drag and downforce are almost like in opposition to each other in the sense of the equation.
Yep.
Because if you give more preference to downforce, then you're basically sacrificing drag and vice versa. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay.
The equation is more downforce typically equals more drag. You're gonna add downforce, which will allow you to go faster through the corners, but it's going to slow you down on the straightaways. So the compromise that engineers have had to work with for decades, as soon as cars started sprouting wings, they started fighting this compromise. And of course, the guys that got it right would be the guys that win on that particular day. Along the way, it was discovered that if you shape the bottom of the car, really the side pods underneath the car correctly, the floor, right? You shape it correctly, you can take advantage of what's called Bernoulli's principle, which basically says that when a liquid's velocity is increased, and in this case, the liquid is air, when a liquid's velocity is increased, it exerts less pressure on the object that it's flowing over. And so what this means is that if you go and shape the bottom of your car correctly, you can accelerate the air that's going underneath the car, which then causes a low pressure area. And then what happens is that the air flowing over the top of the race car, even though it's still going very fast, it's going slower than the air that's going underneath the car. When that happens, you create downforce. And so this is what gives you ground effects. And, sometimes it's called, like the Venturi effect, ground effects. And sometimes they refer to them as tunnel cars. But basically, that's what we have today in Formula One. We had it for the there had been a long hiatus where ground effect had been banned because the cars were producing so much downforce and they were going through corners so fast that they had to do something to slow the cars down because it had gotten really, really effective. And so they banned them and then reintroduced them sort of like probably 30 years later back to Formula One for the 2022 season. The beauty of ground effect is that you can have a huge jump in downforce for little cost in drag. So it's really way more efficient than the wings. And the idea would be, and what has been attempted before, is to have a ground effect system that produces so much downforce that the front wings and the rear wings are actually quite small, in theory, and they become what I would call a trim tab. If you needed a little more downforce at the front because you had maybe a little bit of understeer and you needed to kill it, okay, you just crank in just a little bit of front wing and just go on down the road, but you don't really worry about how much downforce the wings produce. That's not the case today. In F1, obviously, the wings that they use are very sophisticated, mostly because they're doing everything they can to cram the car straight into the road, because the more downforce you have, the faster you can go through the corners.
So it sounds like things like pressure and speed and even like the height of the car are all going to relate to this issue of ground effect and downforce and drag. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things they're going to do with a ground effects car, because of the tunnels that are on either side of the car underneath the side pod, what they're going to do is they're going to say, what we want to do is we want to make the actual tub of the chassis, the survival cell that the driver sits in. We want to make it as narrow as possible. Because if you think about it, let's say you have, a differential that's causing you to produce, I don't know, pick a number, 10 pounds of downforce per square inch. Well, for every square inch, then you want to be able to pick up as many square inches as you possibly can in that tunnel. And so if you can make the car, the tub of the car a little bit narrower, that allows you to make the tunnel a little bit wider, which increases the number of square inches sitting in that tunnel. If that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
Right? You increase the square inches, that means the tunnel is bigger. Therefore, you're creating even more downforce. So you can imagine on a Formula One car, they're doing everything they can to make the survival cell as narrow as possible, the packaging of the engine and the transmission and all those things super, super narrow. And you'll also see some of the teams opting for a longer wheelbase, because that longer wheelbase, the distance between the front wheels and the rear wheels, if it's longer, that means the tunnel can be longer. That means you can produce more downforce. Now there's, at some stage, there's a law of diminishing returns, and you start getting things, get to the point where it really doesn't make sense because you start losing in other areas, right? And I think, in many times you'll see that like the Mercedes has the longer wheelbase compared to the Red Bull.
Yeah, that's a lot for a non-STEM person like me to take all in. But I think the basic principles are making sense to me, that
Right.
that creating this or maximizing how you shape the car affects the ability of how it's going to move through the air, and then also affect its grip onto the car.
Yep.
And that is also, this is something you said earlier that I wanted to ask the follow-up question on, is that you said about the pressure. It sounds like pressure and the dynamics of what's going on in the day have a significant effect to the ground effect, its benefits, I guess.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
And so, and I feel like in our conversation that we had where we did the race review of Mexico, and this came up and we said, hey, let's have a follow-up conversation on this, because I said everyone kept talking about the air pressure and the significance of Mexico's elevation.
Right.
So that's what you're talking about here, why it's so challenging to set up there. Not that it
Correct.
isn't challenging to set up elsewhere in the year, but that
Right.
is a significant difference in every other race. And so the engineers have to think very differently when they're approaching the Mexico setup. I'm also assuming that things like Singapore also are going to make a difference, because it's not like you have a flat surface the entire time, but
Correct.
like bouncing are also. But I have a feeling you might talk about that a little bit more when it comes to that. You said the air on the top of the car is what's exerting that pressure, and then the air underneath the car is also exerting a different pressure, which is what you're trying to deal with,
Right.
right?
It's that pressure
Ultimately.
differential. I mean, if you
Mm-hmm.
think about it, one of the things that when these cars were first coming out, what they realized is that there's now a thing called the aerodynamic center of pressure. And it literally made the difference between a car that handled well and didn't handle so well. And if you think about it, it really, really makes sense. You'd want that center of pressure somewhere, I would think, in the middle of the car. I don't know that for sure, so I wouldn't quote me on that. But basically, you would have to design the shape of the tunnels under the car to make sure you got that aerodynamic center of pressure at just the right place, or the car would be just diabolical.
It seems like such a fascinating, delicate dance that you're
Yep.
having to do. And even if you pull all your data from what's happened over years, you can't really truly know where it's going to land, because that day, maybe it is a storm day, or
Mm-hmm.
like all the other stuff, which even then we would argue data tells you at that time of the year what that area could expect, but it's still that variable, which makes the fun of the racing and the challenge of what they're all doing. It seems like it would be a huge competitive advantage if you get it right and
Yes.
everyone else tries but they get it wrong. And that it also, this is part of the design challenge of how
Mm-hmm.
much I would assume you kind of do a stable, as much as you could do stable, and then around it are those margins, which goes back to, I feel like, a conversation where you highlighted the challenge Red Bull is going to have this year, of how much more can they gain, because they seem to have really unlocked something,
Right.
right? And
Yep.
so but the incentive is really to keep this idea of ground effect, even if it's not necessarily like the skirts you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
but at least the concept of ground effect
Right.
as much as within the rules. Oh,
Yep.
wow. Okay, so I'm going to give you a shameless plug in the sense that I'm trying to wrap my brain around this by listening to you. But I don't know if our listeners all know that you have a YouTube channel, and it's
Yep.
called Begin Again. And
Yep.
I'm going to tell you that I think you should show this somehow in your world of Begin Again, and explore this visually for your audience, and hopefully our audience here on the podcast will go over and check out your material there, because it's fascinating stuff. I love what you're doing there. And so shameless plug for you as
Well,
your
thank
friend.
you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and just to demonstrate what a clueless dad that I really, really am, I picked the name Begin Again for my YouTube channel, and only after I had gone and set it up and had produced videos and content and all that, did I realize that there's a Taylor Swift song by the name of Begin Again. And so, if you do go on to YouTube and you type in Begin Again, you will get Taylor Swift. So, and that's not me. I'm pretty sure anybody could look at me and know, yeah, it's not Taylor. So, just saying. So,
I love that.
anyway, but if you put in Begin Again kart racing, like racing go karts, KART, if you put that in, then you'll find my channel, and I would love for you to take a visit. And Sabrina, you bring up a great idea. And I know exactly how I can do it, because I happen to know where a ground effect car is parked, and it's about 20 minutes from my house. So yes, I could do that. So thank you. That's
Oh,
awesome.
that'd be great. I
Yep.
would love to see this being discussed by you. Okay,
Well,
so let
maybe,
me. Oh, go
maybe
ahead.
what you should do is come when we film it, and then you could see the car in person.
Oh, that would be so fun. Yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
Let's see. Well, you know what? Let's also ask our listeners, do you guys want to hear that? Do you want to see that?
Yeah.
And please go check out Dick's show, begin again on YouTube. Okay. So, okay, we talked about what exactly is ground effect. Now, Dick, can you tell us about how this like came to be? Like, how was it discovered and brought into the world
Sure.
of F1?
Sure. I mean, it's a great story because, back in the late 1960s, a man named Jim Hall, who is a Texan race driver, very much the innovator. He figured out that if he took an airplane wing, turned it upside down, and mounted it to his Can-Am prototype sports car, all of a sudden his car was really fast going around corners, and he pretty much annihilated the competition until everybody said, guess we need to have a wing, which lasted about 2 races before they figured that part out. And so by, sort of 1968, Formula One cars were starting to sprout wings that were like these massive wings that were way, way, way above the car. They were mounted on these real spindly little kind of sticks almost, and massive wings. And of course, the mounting and all that was just absolutely not up to the task of the downforce that was being produced by these cars, even back then, where the wings were, let's face it, pretty crude. But they were doing things like they figured out that, if you needed more downforce, well, you'd have to crank up the wing angle, right? And in other words, the nose of the wing would go down, the tail of the wing would go up, and you'd produce all sorts of downforce. But like we talked earlier, that would produce drag. And so somebody, I believe it was Colin Chapman, came up with this brilliant idea on his Lotuses. Hey, wouldn't it be great if we could get that wing to lay flat when we're going down the straightaway? And then just before we got to the corners, the driver would throw a switch, the wing would go into this, much steeper angle and produce a whole bunch of downforce. We'd get through the corner, and then he'd flip the switch again and flatten that wing out for the straightaway that followed. Genius, right? Well, the moment that started happening, cars started crashing because they were literally breaking off the mounts. I mean, some of the guys were thinking, well, gosh, we could mount the wings to the chassis, but what would be really effective? Let's mount it to the suspension. And so,
What?
yes, they would mount the wings to the suspension, and so you'd see these cars going down the road, and the wheels are hitting bumps, and the wings are going back and forth. It's just horrible. Look at some of the old pictures from about 1968 or 69. Anyway, there had been a number of wrecks, and finally at the Spanish Grand Prix in 1969, a couple of massive wrecks, and the FIA stepped in and said, no, we're not doing this. And so they came up with much, much lower wings that were mounted to the chassis, and there was, a real push for safety because, I mean, guys, nobody had been killed, but people were breaking legs and getting their noses busted and, all those kinds of things. And it was, I think what really did it is in 1969, Jochen Rindt had a massive crash in practice for the Spanish Grand Prix. And I mean, like, he stepped out of basically this, partial tub of a race car. That's private. I mean, there was nothing left. And they all said, yeah, maybe we need to think about this one.
That also ties in with an episode that we hope to share soon about just the improvements to safety in the world of F1, where those improvements to safety actually got the energy inside of the community to take a look at this stuff. And so knowing that teaching that you've already given me, I find it fascinating that you're talking about these kinds of things happening onto the actual car, when I know that during this time, things like the guardrails and the distance from the track aren't what we're accustomed to seeing today at all.
Not even close. Yeah, not even close.
Yeah, it was a different era back then. It sounds like just really era of innovation and bravery, really. Not saying that they're not brave to get in now, but back then there was a different level of risk going on.
Oh yeah, way different level of risk. And so, now they're running much smaller wings mounted much lower in the car on the chassis. And so Chapman goes away, and he designs a couple of very innovative cars in the early 70s that were built to the rules. And then they went into a real rough spot after about 1974. And Lotus really got into the doldrums. I mean, it was like, it used to be that everybody wanted to drive for Lotus. Now it was sort of like, yeah, we don't want anything to do with it. And at the beginning of the 1976 season, Chapman had designed another car, very innovative, that actually had so much adjustability to the car that you literally could adjust the wheelbase to make it longer or shorter. You could make the track wider or narrower depending on the track, all this kind of stuff. Car was very innovative, didn't work very well. And at the same time, Mario Andretti had gone through a real tough spot in his career, hadn't won many races, wasn't seeing a whole lot of success. And he and Chapman had this kind of friendship, and they kind of got together and said, look, neither one of us like where we're at. Let's pull each other out of this hole. And so that began this really amazing relationship that Colin Chapman had with Mario Andretti for several seasons of Formula One. And so they began developing this car that started the season out as just a complete pig. And as they were developing the car, Chapman and his design team kind of started realizing that there may be downforce to be had out of the bottom of the car. And so while the car looked like a very standard kind of car, they actually started doing some experimentation to see what they could learn about the airflow that is underneath the car, and could that be exploited to produce downforce. And by the end of the year, the car was good enough that Mario Andretti won the Japanese Grand Prix there in 1976, which, of course, very famous race. And if you want to know more about it, watch the movie Rush. And because it's quite, for a Hollywood movie, it's pretty accurate. And the way they depict the race and all that kind of stuff, Mario came through and won in a car that really wasn't up to scratch to, say, the Ferrari or the McLaren that were the top cars of that year. Anyway, Chapman learned a lot during the 1976 season. And so in 1977, brings out an all-new car called the Lotus 78. And it was a full ground effect car. It wasn't fully optimized, but it was a full ground effect car. And the car had a very unique shape, very unique, and actually quite a pretty car. And honestly, the Ferrari of this past season, to my mind, bears a sort of a resemblance to the Lotus 78. Yeah, I'm not saying they're identical or anything like that, but you look at certain design cues and all that, and you kind of go, yeah, man, that kind of looks like the 78, And that car, the opposition, they just weren't ready for this car. And it was clearly the fastest car out there. But Andretti had some really bad luck, still won quite a few races with it, including the U.S. Grand Prix when it was held at Long Beach. I can remember as a kid, Mario by that time was my guy. And I literally was on my knees in front of the TV in my, parents' den, having, I would say at least half a dozen strokes, because it was really, really clear that Mario was in it for a shot to win. And he pulled off a pass late in the race and won the race. And I believe that was the first win for the Lotus 78. And of course, the teenage me lost my mind on that deal. But there were other races that, like he was leading the South African Grand Prix prior to the U.S. Grand Prix, and leading quite handily. And a fuel injector metering unit somehow went from the mixture setting that they had, which was relatively lean, it went over to full rich, and it started burning too much fuel. And Mario felt it change and he backed off, but because they ran the car to basically do a race distance and then threw an extra gallon of fuel in, for safety's sake, he ran out of gas like a lap and a half from the end of the race, and he lost it. So he gained no points, even though he led most of the race. And it was stuff like that happened that prevented him from winning the world championship in 1977. So, but anyway, clearly the car was onto something. And so all the teams, that they were racing against, took notice of this, and they began designing their ground effect cars for the 1978 season. But Chapman, being the genius that he was, came out with a car that was called the Lotus 79, and it was an optimized, for the day, full ground effect car. And Lotus just blew the opposition away. And Andretti won the world championship at the Italian Grand Prix, which we'll talk about in that safety podcast that we did as well, where unfortunately Andretti's teammate Ronnie Peterson died in a crash right at the start of the race. But, and strangely enough, for whatever reason, I believe Peterson was driving the year-old Lotus 78 when that happened for some reason.
Mm.
Anyway, not content with success, Chapman then produced the Lotus 80. And this is where we start getting into the deal of you can't have too much of a good thing. They went with a little bit longer wheelbase. They narrowed up the chassis, making the tunnels wider and all that. And the Lotus 80, because it had so much ground effect, this is when the phenomenon of porpoising was discovered. And what porpoising is, and this is something that a lot of the teams like Mercedes and Ferrari dealt with a lot in the 2022 season, a little bit in 23, but a whole bunch in 22. And that is that the car produces so much downforce that the ride height of the car literally goes down, right? Because downforce is pushing the car into the track. The car actually, the bottom of the car bottoms against the asphalt of the racetrack, shutting off the airflow. And when that airflow gets shut off, all the downforce goes away. So then the car immediately goes up off the track. The springs of the suspension lift the car back up in the air. The car then starts producing more downforce, and it goes right back down onto the road. And when it hits the road, downforce ends, and then the car releases and it goes back up to the top and does it again. And so you could see it on the onboard video. The car's bouncing like crazy and very, very difficult to deal with. And it just would wear out the drivers. Well, that's what happened to the Lotus 80. Brilliant design, but they couldn't make it work. It was also the first car where they realized that they were producing so much downforce that they really had to start concerning themselves with the aerodynamic center of pressure, which is what we talked about earlier on. You've got to get that center of pressure hitting just the right part of the car. Otherwise, the car becomes undrivable.
There's a lot there, but I think it's such good stuff, especially when you tie it back to for newer fans who maybe just started paying attention to Formula One in the last, 2-3 years. They may have heard the term, the car's porpoising, and just seen the bumping of the head of the driver, but not understanding actually what's going on, or as you note, the violence of it to their body. And then when we connect it back historically to how the discovery of it, the development of it, and then I like how you said too much of a good thing, when you go too far, which goes back to what we were talking about, the drag versus downforce balance. Like as I'm listening to you, I keep thinking what a delicate balance and or dance engineering, design, the team. That's when we don't even discuss the fact that another variable that is there is the actual driver and the driver's confidence. And if this isn't stable in their mind, they can't go right up to the cusp, or they go too far, right? Or they stay too far. So you can't even maximize all the design or the engineering elements of this if the driver doesn't feel confident in what you've done. And so that gives me even greater respect of when we look at it historically, these drivers becoming aware of it, having to change what had been their driving style, and then develop alongside this new concept over those years that you've shared with us. So that's very fascinating to me. Okay, so you said this idea of not getting it right in the porpoising is one challenge. What are some other challenges to ground effects?
Well, so the other thing, and it's all physics, but the lower you run the car without touching the surface, the lower you run the car, the more ground effect you produce. Okay, that's the other phenomenon that you get. And so what this implies is you've got to run very, very hard springs, or in the case of a Formula One car, torsion bars, very, very stiff, right? It takes, and back when, Formula One cars ran springs back in the late 70s or early 80s, and they were still on ground effects, they were running like springs that would take like 3,000, 4,000 pounds to compress them 1 inch.
Okay, let me ask a dumb question. Is this a component of the car when you say springs? Like it's actually something springs. Okay, got it. Yep. Okay,
suspension springs. Sorry about that. But I mean, I want you to think about this. You have a car that weighs, let's say with full fuel, 1,400 pounds. I don't pick a number, 1,500 pounds. I don't care. And you got in each corner of the car a spring that is so stiff that it takes 4,000 pounds to compress it an inch. So basically, you have a rock hard suspension on a car that doesn't weigh very much. So that gives you an idea how much downforce these guys were producing.
Wow.
But you had to run those hard springs, because if the car got too low and it started touching the ground a whole lot, what would basically happen is you would literally grind the belly off the car. And so you had to have those hard springs. But that causes a big problem, because even though you've got to have those hard springs to keep you within the aerodynamic envelope, right? You want to keep the car pretty close to parallel to the road surface. But if you're hitting bumps and all that kind of stuff, the car is moving around with those bumps, right? So that's never perfectly parallel to the road. You add those bumps, and now all of a sudden the wheels are not flowing over the bumps, they're bouncing over the bumps, basically, which made the cars even more difficult to drive. It'd be like driving a really, really fast go-kart. And I would argue probably the go-karts of today, the way they're designed, they actually have quite a bit of flexibility in their, air quotes, suspension. Anyway, the bottom line is that they had to go with really, really stiff springs back in the day, which was doing all sorts of horrible things to the drivers' backs and all that kind of stuff, but you had to have it. And it was really funny, because if you look at some of the drivers back in the day, they were not built like the drivers that you see today, who are fairly slightly built.
Yes.
Some of those guys, like an Alan Jones, you look at a picture of him, that guy, he could have been like a wrestler.
Yeah.
Big, heavy shoulders and, all that kind of stuff. Nigel Mansell was another good example, although he was both ground effect era as well as when they eliminated ground effect.
So you said the operating envelope. Like, do you mean like the optimization aspect
Right.
of this?
Yeah. And so they've had to come up with new ways, because obviously, if you're on a bumpy track, having hard springs is not a good thing.
Right. Like Singapore, going back to what I said earlier. So what I'm hearing you say is going back to, you said Lotus and Chapman. Here we flash forward to 2023, 24. We have Newey's developed the Red Bull, right? And it's doing fantastic everywhere. And then we get to Singapore. If you're trying to utilize the aerodynamic element of ground effects,
the platform,
the platform is not able to really, it's extremely hard because of the variables you said earlier in our conversation to get it right, which is probably what was happening in Singapore, because it is so bumpy in a street track. And they probably did some level of adjustment or lesson learned by the time they got to Las Vegas, which is why we didn't see it as badly, even though I would assume they probably had it to some level. And then maybe Monaco, they were still trying to figure it out. And Baku, like, you were seeing it, but not nearly as much because of the streets themselves. Am I on the right track?
Yeah, you are. And in a place like Monaco, which is very, very specific, right? You're not going anywhere as fast at Monaco as you would at, say, Vegas, right? So you're producing less downforce, because that's the other part. The faster you go, the more downforce you produce. That's the other part of it. See?
Right.
And this is way outside the conversation for this time, but it's a good conversation for another one of our conversations. And that is that the development of the dampers or shock absorbers to Americans has advanced so much since the first ground effect cars appeared to the ground effect cars that we have today, that a lot of the issues around the hard springs versus soft springs and all that is actually taken up by the dampers. And we can talk about that at some other time, because
that would be great.
That's a long conversation right there.
I would love to talk about that. Anything that will help me to greater appreciate the design and engineering amazing stuff that I get to be entertained by, to pull back the curtain a little bit and make it easier for non-STEM people like me, I think is all valuable. I've got a frame of reference. So I did ask you, and I led us off the trail. What are the other challenges that you face when you have a ground effects car?
So another one that is kind of interesting is the fact that, we already talked about setting the car up low, and that means hard springs and all that. But the other part is that air always tends to go where there's least resistance. And so what happens is that it tends to want to spill out from underneath the car, out the sides, as opposed to, behaving itself and going all the way to the end of the tunnel and giving all that extra all that extra downforce. Well, if that air starts spilling out the side, then the tunnel loses efficiency and it doesn't produce as much downforce as you would like it to produce. And so the way they handled this back in the late 70s and early 1980s is they hung what they were calling skirts. And they were basically pieces of plexiglass that were spring loaded, that were mounted on the edges of the side pods of the car, and they ran the full length of the car. And those skirts, basically by being spring loaded, would literally rub against the track and provide a seal for those tunnels. And they were unbelievably effective. I ran a guy in a Ralt RT5 Super V, which had full length tunnels on it. And a Super V back in those days, think of it as like 2 steps below a Formula One car, 2.5. And so it had some serious tunnels on it. But when we threw those skirts on it, because they were legal at the time, the car immediately went faster through the corners. The steering got heavy. The driver was like, I can't believe how fast this car goes. And we actually ran that car in the rain one time, and literally the mist that was thrown out from underneath the tunnel out the back of the car, I promise you, went at least 30 feet in the air. I mean, it was
wow.
it was like you could see. It was the first time we had the car in the wind tunnel. It was like the poor man's wind tunnel, right? And I was like, that's absolutely insane how high that air. But see, that's what the tunnel does. It's creating that suction that's pushing the car down, but that air's got to go somewhere. And when it finally gets out of the tunnel, it goes straight up.
Because the spill is something you really totally can't control, but the goal is to harness that. So you can create this downforce advantage and use physics to improve your speed and design, right?
And so those skirts were outlawed, because what happened is they became stuck occasionally. And all of a sudden, a driver would go into a corner and the skirt was no longer in contact with the ground. And so he had way less downforce, and it caused crashes. And eventually that killed Patrick Depailler in a Alfa Romeo F1 car. He had a skirt failure and went off the track at high rate of speed and was killed instantly. Basically, he went from having, pick a number, 3,000 pounds of downforce. Now all of a sudden he had 1,000 pounds of downforce. And so there was no way he was going to make that corner.
It's like a switch. Just all of a sudden, how can you as a human adapt to that quickly? Wow.
Right. You can't.
How do the drivers adapt to this?
Well, and it still works to this day. The new Formula One cars, obviously skirts are not allowed. And what they do is they spend a lot of time sculpting the floor to create these little, they call them eddies of air that actually act as the skirt. And it's those little eddies of air that prevent the rest of the air from spilling out underneath the side of the car. It's absolutely huge.
That is. It's like you technically don't have a skirt, but you do have a skirt.
That's right.
Because you're doing it inside the body of the underside.
And
that's so classic.
Yeah,
that's
and
hilarious.
you're using the air to do it. And it's just like you're using air to make air behave. It's insane. So anyway, those guys are a little smarter than me. Anyway,
I don't know about that. I think you could run with them.
What's interesting is ground effect cars, and think about this, the faster you go, the more downforce you make, right? We've talked about that. So when you approach a corner, you're better off approaching it too fast, because you're making more downforce, than to approach it too slow, because then you're making less downforce. The really, really, really good drivers learn very quickly to trust their car, and they use that to their advantage.
So do you train them to do this? Like, is this a skill, or is this something that just kind of you have to work through
you got to work through
the mental? Okay. And so is that something you see in karting? Or is that something you start to see you can train them when they're in single seaters?
Yeah, they have to be in single seaters that have ground effects. Going back to that same Ralt Super V, that car certainly was that case. And I worked quite closely with a guy named Mike Finch, who's a New Zealander, very talented racing driver, and who's still driving today, believe it or not. And Mike had driven a ground effect car before. But this was the first time that he had really spent time in it. And he realized that there was so much time to be gained on corner entry by just carrying more speed than he thought was possible. And so for him, it was literally knowing that he had no option but to trust physics to go faster.
I mean, because when you talk about that too, I keep thinking about what we said earlier about that sweet spot optimum operating window. You really need to know that car and
Yeah,
to know if it's sitting in that in the real time as you're doing all the different things that you're doing as a driver, and then
correct.
moving it forward to what we're experiencing today in F1. The driver is doing that while driving defensively or offensively, listening to the engineering person in their head. So when we hear the drivers maybe snippy or not excited to talk, right, or wanting the answers fast, you can understand a little bit better, I think, why they're reacting because of all the pressure
Yep.
they're trying to work through with a car.
Yep.
That if it all of a sudden gets out of that operating window, things can go terribly wrong.
Yeah. I mean, if, terribly wrong could be just they're too slow. If you're suddenly get a whole bunch of porpoising or something like that, I mean, there's not much you can do except hope that there's somebody who's a really, really good, either a chiropractor or a massage therapist that can get the drivers back, back in shape so he can go drive the next day. It's that violent.
I think that sometimes we don't fully, especially non-racers like me, sitting there and watching it from the comfort of our couch, we may not understand when the driver is making these statements like, oh, so-and-so did this or so-and-so did that, or needing those answers. Yes, there's some level of like they're playing to the rules and knowing that they're on radio, but there is legit stuff that's going on there that is creating pressure in their minds, or they're having to analyze and adjust and be one with their car. Like
Yep.
that is the skill that these people are doing. Nexus of science and art and intuition and skill and then luck. All of that, it's coming together.
Yeah. Some
In
days
this
it's better to be
moment.
lucky than good, right?
You're so cool, Dick. Like you're a racer. And also you're able to tell this kind of stuff to people like me, the rest of our audience, who we can have hopefully everybody listening to this will have a greater appreciation to what we cheer on Sundays for the Grand Prix, or when we're witnessing free practice or quali, because especially those who are not racers, we can really see this with a new level, new glasses, I guess, or clearing our vision a bit.
Yeah. I mean, for sure, like when you watch quali in Formula One, the very, very top guys are on such a knife edge. And so what they're doing is pretty amazing. In the race, you don't usually see those guys at what we call 10 tenths. They're at some level below that, 7 tenths, 8 tenths, because they have fuel numbers to make and they've got tires to manage and all that kind of stuff. But in qualifying, they're at 10 tenths, man. And they're right on the edge. The other thing is that as downforce goes up, so do G forces in the cockpit. And it's interesting because Formula One cars have power steering, but in the old days, they did not have power steering. And the amount of strength it took to drive the car was quite exceptional. And it's amazing to feel it. It's hard to describe, but the steering wheel as downforce gets piled onto the car, the steering wheel gets harder and harder to turn. If you think about like the Indy cars, they produce a big number of downforce, but of course they're running at a much higher speed on the ovals and than an F1 car would. And they do not have power steering. And so what has to be done to a driver's forearms, biceps, neck, shoulders, all that kind of conditioning work that has to be done. Again, subject of another conversation, but it's pretty remarkable about what has to be done, because we all know that F1 drivers work out like crazy, and they have to be able to take the G forces, but at least they have the power steering to take a lot of that weight out of the steering wheel. And that's super helpful. And to me, it's a bit of a safety advantage too, just from driver fatigue,
Definitely the fatigue side, physical and mental. When you said all that, it made me think of some of our friends of the podcast that I don't know where this episode will air in relation to some that we've already recorded that are actual pilots. And it made me think of like the old World War II pilots and their planes versus a modern plane today.
Right.
And how the development more and more realized how much there's that parallel. I think because you and John have both noted it between flying world and the driving world.
Yeah.
That's many, as we've even talked, this is aerodynamic principles that were also gained from flying. It's fascinating to me because it is a different era that when this is introduced, but then with the modern innovations and technology advancements, you do have some areas of where you can protect the driver.
Years ago, I had the wonderful opportunity to sit down and have lunch with Johnny Rutherford, who won the Indy 500 3 times. And the first time he won the 500, he was driving a McLaren that did not have ground effects. It had what we call a flat bottom, which means that really there's no aerodynamic curvature or anything like that underneath the car. It's just basically a straight line from the nose of the car to the tail of the car. And so all the downforce was produced off the wings. And he said that the next time that he won the 500, he was driving a full ground effect machine. His second and third wins were on ground effect cars. And he said that before you would drive around the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and you would be kind of like, turn the steering wheel, turn the steering wheel. And yes, you were going really fast, and yes, you were on the limit and all those things, but the G-forces were nothing. And he said he got in a ground effect car, and all of a sudden he found himself grunting in every corner against the G-forces, because all of a sudden he was pulling 4 or 5 Gs every single corner for 500 miles. And so he was grunting every lap, 4 or 5 times as he would go around the track. And he said it was just exhausting. And so he had never been a guy that had worked out, but he said as soon as he started driving that car and realized what he was in for, he was straight into the gym and started lifting weights and working on his neck and shoulders and all that kind of stuff. And nothing's changed since then. And that was late 1970s when that happened. So the car he won the 500 in the second and third time was a copy of the Lotus 79 that was adapted to running in races like the Indy 500, where you get it wrong and pound a concrete wall. You want a stronger car.
You pushed me to think and learn in an area that I don't feel confident in, but you made it approachable. And I hope that this helps our audience. We would love to hear what your thoughts are, other questions that you think we should have discussed. Thank you for the time and the thought that you put into helping all of us as non-racers better appreciate what's going on in the technology aspect of Formula One. Okay, friends, what did you think of our conversation? Shout out to Daniel for your suggestion that we do tech talks like these. For all our friends in the Two Guys, A Girl, and F1 community, please continue sending your suggestions and feedback. Drop me a line via email, sabrina@2guysagirlandf1.com. Also, we need your help. To continue growing in the crowded podcasting world as an indie podcast, we need you, our friends, to make sure you're following and rating us on your favorite podcast apps, as well as listening and sharing episodes with other F1 fans. This episode would be great for new fans. And with that, let me say, we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in, because we're just two guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.